in a series called Overcoming Giants. And we're looking at that big story that's in the first part of the Bible, where the nation of Israel were in slavery in Egypt. And God rose up that leader called Moses to lead them out of slavery and towards and into this place that he'd promised them that was wonderful, that was fruitful, that was a place that you'd want to live. And so Moses came out, he led the people out of Egypt through the Red Sea into this desert place that should have just taken a couple of weeks to pass through and towards the promised land. But as they got closer to the promised land, they noticed that the people that lived there were big. And if they were going to inherit this land, they were going to have to disperse these people. And God had actually promised them that he would do it for them. But they got scared. They were overwhelmed. They were intimidated by these giants. And as a result, they just ended up spending 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And all of that generation missed out until Joshua, Moses' successor, rose up, took on the mantle, and led the people into the promised land. And he took on these nations, the 7 Canaanite nations, the people that lived there, the people that were big and strong. They were giants to these people, but they weren't just nations. It was a historical event, but they weren't just nations. The names that these nations were given actually represent some of the giants that we face in everyday life. You see, some of the giants that they faced that were stopping them from entering this promised land, are the same things that we face in our everyday lives. You know, all of us face some sort of giant. All of us. Even psychologists, they recognize these things that stop people living just normal lives. You know, people have all sorts of phobias today. Strange phobias as well. You know, you get people with really weird phobias. But just, people can be paralyzed by something that will just keep them trapped. Things like this phobias of being in public spaces. And so people are trapped at home, not able to live normal lives. And psychologists and counselors, they spend hours and hours and hours trying to help people that are caught up in all these sorts of phobias and disorders and all these problems and issues that people are facing. But as a Christian, I don't believe that the whole area is just psychological. You see, as Christians, we've got promises upon every single one of our lives. Every one of us is called, if you're a follower of Jesus, then you are called to a mission. You've got purpose for being here on this earth. You are not here by accident. You're not here just to live, eat, sleep, and die. You're here for a purpose. You're here to make a difference. The world should be different when you leave this place to when you came in. You should have made some sort of positive difference. But so often we're trapped by these giants in our lives. And they're actually, even a lot of them are psychological, a lot of them that happen in situations, they're people that come against us. But behind all of that, there are spiritual forces. You don't hear that talked about in the news or anywhere like that. But there are real spiritual forces. Paul says in Ephesians that we don't battle against flesh and blood, but the powers and the principalities, the spirits that want to stop us from entering into our destiny. They whisper lies. temptations, put people in fear. They misinformation. They use misinformation to get people working against each other. And all of a sudden, the church that should be the most powerful force in this world can become stagnant if we're not willing to take on these giants in our lives. Now, Moses and his generation were overcome by the giants without even going into battle. Joshua took on the giants before he even went into battle. We're going to read from Deuteronomy 7, verse 1, that the giants we've faced so far are fear and discouragement. Well, we're going to talk about two more of them today. Deuteronomy 7, verse 1. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you're entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger, I said longer last week, larger and stronger than you. Well, this week we're going to talk about 2 of those giants. So I'm not going to do it quite how we've done it the last couple of weeks because I won't have time to go into that much detail. But I just want to talk about these 2 particular giants that in many ways have many things in common, but in many other ways seem the polar opposite of each other. The Amorite giant and the Jebusite giant, and that means nothing to most of us because these are words that, it was written in Hebrew here. But even those words go back further. So we've got to get down to the meaning of these words to understand what kind of giants they represent. So the Amorite giants, if we could go on to the next slide, the Amorite giants, the name, it comes from the word Amor, which the Hebrew verb to speak, to say, or to boast is the same as the noun Amor. To speak, to say, or to boast. It means to speak in a boastful, prideful sort of way. The Amorite giants. The Amorites lived in the mountains. They lived in the thin air. They literally looked down on others. And the Amorite spirit lifts itself up and puts others down. Now, they didn't just live in the promised land. The Amorites, they were split up into kingdoms. So there were at least 7 kingdoms. And at least 2 of them were outside of the promised land. So Moses actually went to war with 2 of the kings of the Amorites. I'll be impressed if anybody knows their names. Og, you remember that one? And the other one is something like Sihon. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Sihon or something like that. Og and Sihon, two of the kings of the Amorites that lived in the wilderness where Moses and the Israelites were wandering about. And we'll come on to that in a second. But they were potentially very tall people, very big people, or at least they liked to put over that impression. King Og, it describes in Deuteronomy chapter 3 that his bed was just under 2 meters wide, which, it's just a double bed. But it was 4 meters long. He had a bed that was 4 meters long. He was either very tall, very rich, or at least liked to look that way. Because he had a 4 meter long bed. It's in Deuteronomy 3, verse 11. The Amorites were people whose name means to boast, to spread themselves out, who like to look big and high up. The Amorite giants. Now, not many people would admit to being influenced by that sort of thing. Oh, yeah, I don't boast. Nobody who boasts thinks they boast. But actually, we can use words to put others down because of insecurities within ourselves. Because we feel the need to lift ourselves up. Because we don't feel very big, we try and make ourselves bigger, and we use the things we say, the things we do. The words that we use when speaking about people or to people can be influenced by this need to big ourselves up, the Amorite giant. And it can actually steal our destiny. King Saul is an example. For those that know the Old Testament history of the kings, you'll know about one of the famous kings called King Saul, who was actually quite a tall, he was seen to be head and shoulders above other people. But he'd got this need to big himself up, so much so that when this young pretender came along called David, he tried whatever he could to push him down and to lift himself up. It's that Amorite giant that comes from insecurity. It comes from pride. It's something we often don't recognize, but is very pervasive. The other giant that I want to speak about today, the Jebusite giant, it almost seems like the polar opposite, because it means to tread down or to be trodden down. To be trodden down. And if you read the list, now this list of the 7 nations is mentioned quite a few times through the books of Moses and in Joshua and even in Judges. And the Jebusites will nearly always be mentioned last. They're always the last name on the list. They didn't have a great deal of land. In fact, we don't even know whether they were a direct descendant. The Jebusites were descendants of Canaan, but whether they were just a mixture of the other nations or not, I don't know. But they were called Jebusites because they lived in a city called Jebus. Jebus. Or it's probably pronounced completely different, but it's spelled Jebus. Now, it was just a small place. And this is where these people lived. They didn't have as much territory as the other giants. There are people whose name means trodden down. They come from a small, seemingly insignificant town. I say seemingly insignificant because do you know what that town later became? Anybody guess? Jerusalem. One of the most famous cities in the world. One of the most important cities in the world. But it was just a small place back then. It was unimportant, insignificant. The Jebusites are people whose name means trodden down, who come from a small, insignificant town. They're always mentioned last. People who speak themselves down. An example would be Gideon. For those that know the story of the judges in the Bible, they came before the kings. There was one famous guy called Gideon who God had got a great purpose for him. But first of all, he had to drag him up out of a wine press that he was hidden in because he was trodden down by his enemies and he thought he was the least of the least. He thought he couldn't do anything. He thought that he was a nobody. And when God gave him this big task to do, he just laughed. He thought, I can't possibly do that. Because he's overcome by a Jebusite-type giant. It means the Jebusite spirit makes you feel like a nobody. You feel condemned, insignificant, of little value, unnoticed. You feel small. You don't realize your own significance. I've called it the giant of humiliation. I couldn't find a better English word, really, to use for that. But it means to be trodden down. That's why I've used humiliation. So you've got the giant of boastfulness, of the Amorites, and the giant of being trodden down, the Jebusite. So the last few weeks we've been looking at a bit more detail into these giants, and and how they work, how you notice them. All I'm going to do today is just describe their characteristics. And then we'll look at how to overcome them. Now, these two giants share 4 characteristics, but completely differently. They're giants that really have a lot in common, and yet at the same time have a lot that works differently in them. So first of all, both giants attack your identity. If we can have that next slide up. Both giants attack your identity. The Amorite giant is insecure. And that's why it uses words to lift itself up, as a cover for their insecurities. Now, if you're insecure, you don't let people in. You don't let people see the real you. If you go back to Numbers chapter 21, you'll see a time when Moses went against these first 2 giants, or rather these first 2 kings of the nation of the Amorites, Og and Sihon. Moses, he didn't go up to fight these 2 kings. Moses was on a journey. He was coming from Egypt, and he was heading towards the promised land. And there was this land in between that was owned and run by the Amorites. And Moses went up and he said, excuse me, can we come through? We promise we'll be good. We won't touch any of your grapes. We won't touch any of your crops. We'll be really, really pretty pleased. Can we come through? So Moses, he politely asks them if he can come through their land. If you read it, it's in Numbers 21. He asks them, can I come through your land? Now the Amorites, these 2 kings, we don't even read if they answer him. All they do is go straight into battle. They go straight into battle. They actually lose as well. But they don't like anybody coming through. They don't like anybody getting in close. They want to protect their identity. One of the ways you know you're under the influence of the Amorite spirit is when you don't let people close. You close off. You like to have your appearances. You like to keep your appearances up. But you don't like to let people in. You know, the Amorites, they would have had their borders touched a lot of the other lands because they were spread out. So they had a lot of shallow relationships, but they didn't let people in. You could change the word Amorite for Facebook. It'd probably work quite well. The Amorite giant has a problem with identity. The Jebusite giant also has a problem with identity because they think they're a nobody. They don't know their own significance. Life has told them they're insignificant, condemned, unskilled, without value. And that paralyzes them from fulfilling their calling and only reinforces that lie. When you don't fulfill your calling, it reinforces the lie that you're a nobody. You're insignificant. You hide away. It's one of the ways you know you're under the influence. You just hide away, and you make excuses for it while you're hiding away. There's always reasons. So identity, comparison. Both of these giants will cause you to compare in an unhealthy way. The Amorite compares itself with others, sometimes out of jealousy or insecurity. And they wouldn't, when we do those sort of things, we never admit we're doing it. We don't even know we're doing it, but that's the reason we're doing it. But there's a need to put others down and lift yourself up. I'm doing the important job. We see even in church, people in different ministries, I'm the one who's doing the intercessory prayer. I'm the more spiritual one. Or I'm the one who's doing all the practical work. I'm carrying the real burden. We lift ourselves up and reduce the value of others. We compare. It's a destructive and unhealthy comparison. But the Jebusite is just the same. They compare with others, but they don't see the value of what they do. I'm no good at this. I can't preach. I'm not good at witnessing. I'm not educated. I'm not wealthy. I can only do the small, insignificant jobs. And that makes me insignificant. He didn't make Jesus insignificant when he was washing the disciples' feet. But because they feel insignificant, they don't do anything of significance. He thinks it's doing nothing. It often leads to a defeatist or a victim mentality. That unhealthy comparison leaves them unproductive. The next one is submission. Both the Jebusite and the Amorite have a problem with submission. First of all, the Amorite, as you might guess, finds submitting to godly authority or to God very difficult. You see, if you've got a problem with pride, you'll always have a problem submitting. You'll always think that your way is better. But at the same time, the Amorite giant stops you from taking on responsibility because with responsibility comes criticism. And boastful people don't like criticism. They like to stay in the background, point the finger at others, and blame. So on the one hand, they know what to do all the time, but on the other hand, they like somebody else to do it so that they can point the blame. And I say they, but I think many of us will have fallen to this at some point. The Jebusite does submit, but to all the wrong things. Submits to everything. Doesn't know its own authority. And instead of submitting to godly authority, submits to condemnation, lies, fear, temptation. The Jebusite spirit. And then prominence. I couldn't think of the right word for this. But to be effective, we have to be in the right place. We have to be willing to move forward into the right place. To be willing to be seen. The Amorite spirit just pushes itself forward. It's pervasive. It likes to be noticed. The Amorites were everywhere. They were split into kingdoms, and they're the largest territory. They're everywhere. They push themselves forward. Speaks negatively to others to lift itself up. The Jebusite doesn't know its own significance. Its territory is small. Yet its territory was actually Jerusalem. It was small territory, and yet it was one of the most important places in the land. When you look at the story of Moses, you see that these giants had already overcome the people. They were people that the Israelites did often swing from one giant to the other. 1 second they could be thinking, I'm a nobody. Next thing they could think, I could do this better than you. They would challenge Moses' leadership, thinking, what are you doing? We could do this better. In Numbers 14, they say to Moses, what are you doing? We'll choose a leader and we'll go to Egypt. And then the next second, or just before that, they're saying, but we're nobody, we're nothing, and we're small and they're big. We can often find we swing from boasting and arrogance to self-loathing. And that's what the Israelites did. The people in Moses' day were defeated before they even faced the giants. You know, in Numbers 13, verse 3, when they said, "Why is the Lord bringing us into the land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will be taken as plunder." It's clear that these still don't know their identity. They still don't know themselves as the children of God. The children of a good Father who's not going to let them down on his promise. They still don't know their identity as that. They're still comparing themselves to the nations around them. They refuse to submit to Moses' leadership. In Numbers 14, verses 10 to 11. Now, we read Numbers, the start of Numbers 14 last week. Well, in verse 10 to 11, they're about to stone Moses. Moses is about to get stoned by the people. And then they say and then the Lord says to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt?" They can't submit to the godly leadership. The giants had them floored before they'd even approached the land. That intimidation had got to them before they even approached the land. And I think that in church, that happens an awful lot. Sometimes in our insecurity, we'll use words to try and lift ourselves up. But all it does is harm relationships and stops us from entering into our calling. We'll complain about others to hide our particular faults. But again, all it does is rob us of our calling. Or we talk negatively about ourselves. I can't do this. I'm a nobody. I've got guilt. I've got shame. And we rob ourselves of our calling. And I believe God is saying that giant has got to fall. If you're going to move into the purposes that God has got for you, then these giants have got to go. Whichever one you suffer from, and most of us will swing from one to the other. How to overcome the giants? Well, first of all, you need to find your identity in Him. Find your identity in God. That's what Joshua did. He found his identity in the Lord. It says in Joshua 3, verses 10 to 11, This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that He will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. He says, look at the Ark of the Covenant. For those that don't know what the Ark of the Covenant is, it was basically a big, holy box. And inside that box were the 10 Commandments, as well as some other things. But it represented the relationship, the promise between God and the people. And what Joshua says is, look here, this represents the relationship that we have. That's where your identity is. That is where your identity is. Your identity is not what other people think of you. Your identity is not what you do. Your identity is in your relationship, with God. When we realize that, we've got nothing to boast about. Because everything we have is by God's grace. Any skill we've got, any talent we've got, anything we do, it's all by God's grace. We've got nothing to boast about. But at the same time, we've also got no reason to put ourselves down. Because we're loved by a God who loved us enough to send His Son to die for us. So why on earth would we want to talk ourselves down? When we know our identities and our relationship with Christ, we've got no reason to neither boast nor loathe ourselves. Because our identity is in Him. We can do all that God has called us to do. Not because we're special, but because we have a relationship with the one who is. If we want to overcome these giants that come against us, then it starts with that relationship. It starts with knowing our identities in Him. Secondly, look up. Look up. Don't compare yourselves with others. Don't look around and compare yourselves with those that are against you, those that are for you, those that are working alongside. Don't compare yourself. Instead, look up. See, Joshua's a man of faith. He's about to go into Jericho. He's about to be obedient to all that God is doing in him and through him. And then he meets a rather large person. Joshua 5, verses 13 to 14. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" I can imagine that was probably said with a slightly higher pitched voice. Are you for us or for them? Neither, he replied, but as commander of the army of God, I have now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" Joshua looked up and saw this incredible soldier. And he still wanted to know whether that man was with him or with his enemies. He's still comparing the strength of armies, who was with who. But instead, he was told, neither. God doesn't want us to compare. He wants us to look and see who is with us, who is standing in front of us. He wants us to look up and see him. He wants us to look up and see his power is sufficient. He doesn't want us to compare what we've got, what we can do with what anybody else can do, or even who's coming against us. If we just look and see what power is with us to take us into the destiny that God has got for us, then we don't need to compete. We don't need to compare. We don't have to be anybody else. So many Christians think they need to be somebody else. When you see who stands in front of you, you don't need to be anybody else to reach your destiny. Submit to godly authority. The people of Moses' generation really did struggle with this. They sometimes submitted to Moses' leadership, to the Lord God, to Aaron. They sometimes did, and then when they got frightened or when things weren't going well, they would submit when it suited them. In chapter 1 of Joshua, God tells Joshua to lead these people. So he's just taken over from Moses. In chapter 3 of Joshua, God reveals Joshua as this new leader, and everybody looks up to him. That happens in chapter 3. So God tells Joshua to take over in chapter 1. In chapter 3, God exalts Joshua as the new leader. Well, at the end of chapter 1, so before Joshua's been really revealed as this new leader that's going to take over from Moses, before that's really happened, he's got to have some quiet words with two tribes of Israel who don't want land that's in the promised land. They want to settle outside. And he's got to say to them, "Look, guys, I know you're okay settling here, but you need to come with us first and to enter into a battle that you're actually disinterested in. Because you might win it, but actually, and you might lose some people in that battle, but actually it's not going to help you because you're settling here." So he has to get them to go into a battle that they were disinterested in. And I think their response shows that they're willing to submit to godly authority. Joshua 1 verse 17. "Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses." They've clearly learned the importance of submission. You know, And I'm not saying that as pastor, you must submit to the pastor. This is about submitting to one another. This is about submitting to the people of godly authority that God has put in your life, the mentors, the fathers and mothers in the faith. It means in your home, some of the young people in your home, there's godly submission there. In your workplaces. Because even though they may not be godly people, the Bible tells us to still submit to our governors of the land. Submission is one of the things that will actually lead us into the promises that God has for us. Submission to the authority that God has put over us. And of course, to God himself. But the next one is to speak life. Both the Amorite and the Jebusite had a problem with speech. One was boastful, the other one was self-loathing. Well, if you look at the words, be strong and courageous. If you were to look through the Bible and find that phrase, be strong and courageous, it's quite a few times throughout the Bible, but most of them are contained in the book of Joshua. Be strong and courageous. It's contained 3 times, it's contained 4 times in the very first chapter, but 3 of them are by God to Joshua. In fact, at one point he says, be strong and very courageous. 3 times he says to Joshua, be strong and courageous. But then at the end of the chapter, the Israelites say to Joshua, be strong and courageous. In Joshua chapter 10, verse 25, Joshua says to the Israelites, be strong and courageous. Everybody is speaking life to each other. Everybody's speaking life. God's speaking it to the people. They're speaking it to Joshua. Joshua's speaking it to them. They're speaking life. They're not talking themselves down. They're not talking each other down. They're speaking life. If we want to overcome giants, then we have to learn to speak life-giving words to each other. We need a culture in our church that is life-giving, that is life-speaking, where before we say anything else, we're speaking life to one another. We're speaking words of encouragement to one another. Yes, there are times to challenge. Yes, there are times where we need to have difficult conversations. But our culture should be one where we speak life. We need to be a church that speaks life. We need to be a people that speaks life. Not just here, but wherever we go. What are your words known for? If we were to go around to your family and friends, and the same for us, if we were to go around to your family and friends, those closest to you, what would they say about the words that you use? Are they gossiping? Are they complaining? Are they putting others down? Are they boastful? Or do they speak life? Because when you're speaking life to each other, you haven't got time to boast. You haven't got time to put yourself down. It's the antithesis, it's the opposite. Speak life. Where do you find your identity? Are you comparing yourself with others? Are you submitting to godly authority, or are you gossiping and complaining? We have got a purpose to walk into. Every one of us and us as a church. And we've got to learn these lessons, because these forces that come against us will use these sort of things to cause division, to cause fear, to basically paralyze the church, to paralyze you from entering into your destiny, to paralyze the church from entering into its destiny. And we've got to learn to overcome it in a biblical and godly way by narrowing our identity, by looking to God, by submitting, and by speaking life.